Professor Peter Singer, welcome to Norway.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You call yourself a utilitarian, and you have recently co-authored a book called Utilitarianism, A Very Short Introduction. Briefly, what is utilitarianism and why are you a utilitarian?
Well, utilitarianism is an ethical theory. That means it's a theory about how we ought to live, what we ought to do, a theory that tells us what acts are right and what acts are wrong. And in particular, utilitarianism tells us that the right thing to do is the thing that will have the best consequences, all things considered, for all of the beings who are affected by your actions. So that's distinctive from some other ethical theories in that it tells you to look at consequences, not, for example, at whether you obey some rule or divine commandment. And secondly, it tells you that the consequences to look for are those that affect what we might call well-being. So are you making those who are affected by your action better off or worse off? And of course, sometimes you'll make some better off and some worse off, and it tells you to go for the greatest possible surplus, positive balance of making beings better off. And it also tells you to do that for all beings who have interests, which I understand to mean conscious beings, beings who can feel pleasure or pain, and also timelessly, not just today, but as far as you can foresee in the future. So you have to take future consequences into account as far as you can calculate them, and then you look at what action will have the best consequences.
Good. That's a good formulation of utilitarianism. Thank you. Over the last few years, there has been, even though you're a utilitarian, have been for, throughout your career, there has been a shift in your view about what constitutes welfare. And you mentioned now pleasure and pain. Earlier, you defended a view called preference utilitarianism, and you seem to have made a shift over to what's called hedonistic utilitarianism. Could you say a little about what is the difference between those two, and what motivated your shift towards being concerned specifically with pleasure and pain?
You could say that I've gone back to the classical view that was held by the 19th century utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sidgwick. They thought that it's happiness or pleasure and the absence of pain that is the ultimate value, the intrinsic value. For much of my career, I wasn't prepared to say that. I didn't think that we could really lay down that there is an objective value like that, and I preferred the view which in some respects seems more open, more neutral, less paternalistic, that whatever it is that people or other sentient beings prefer, that's what's good for them. So you look at what it is that they want. Well, gradually over the years, I guess I'd been conscious, of course, of objections to that view, and some of them were troubling. For instance, one of them is when you say, what is it that people want, you immediately have the question of, well, do they really know what it is that they're wanting and getting? So a famous example is, I'm thirsty at the moment, and therefore I want to drink what's in this glass. But let's say, unknown to me, you are a malicious person and you've decided the world would be better off without me, and you've put a deadly poison into this glass. Mm-hmm. So now when I say, I want to drink this, what's in this glass, it would clearly not be in my well-being for me to satisfy that preference. And if you really cared about me, you wouldn't want to satisfy this preference. So therefore we have to say, well, it's what you would prefer if you were fully informed about things. And then that starts to become a little more complicated. The example I gave you is pretty straightforward. But so in some cases where you inform people, you might change their preferences about something. Suppose, for example, that you have preferences because you're worried about going to hell after you die, roasting in hell forever. And let's assume that there is no such place, that you won't be punished for anything you do after you die. Then should we say, well, your preference isn't really, let's say, I don't know, not to have sex when you're not married to somebody, because you only prefer that you only prefer not to have sex when you're not married to someone because you think you'll roast in hell forever if you do. So we could say, okay, so we should ignore that, and we should try to arrange occasions for you to have sex because you'll enjoy it. But if we in fact can't change your belief, what is your preference? It starts to become more difficult. So those are some of the objections that led me to be uncomfortable with it. But I suppose a crucial factor in my actually abandoning it was that I also shifted in my views about the nature of ethics. So I used to hold a view that there are no objective truths in ethics, that when we make ethical judgments, I was following my professor at Oxford, R.M. Hare, when we make judgments, we are prescribing what people should do. We're prescribing it under certain constraint. It has to be a prescription that we would follow universally in all relevantly similar circumstances and want others to follow. But still, it wasn't a claim that there is some truth. And this view seemed to fit nicely with the preference view, because you put yourself in other people's situation and then you would want what they would want in those situations. But I got convinced by a number of different philosophers arguing with me. Tom Nagel was one, but ultimately probably the most important was Derek Parfit, that in fact you can defend the idea that there are objective moral truths, and that, for example, it's an objective moral truth that agony is a bad thing. So to inflict agony on someone with no underlying justification, for example, a bit of agony now will mean a lot more people don't experience agony later on. Nothing like that. You're just inflicting agony for its own sake. That's wrong, because agony is intrinsically bad. And I won't go into the arguments why Parfit thinks that. They're quite complicated, but suffice it to say, I did get convinced that was right. And then once you think that, then it becomes, I think, easier to say there are some objective goods, some things that are of intrinsic value: happiness, pleasure, good; pain, agony are bad. And so I moved away from the preference view towards this hedonistic view.
So it seems these theories will, in practice, give many of the same consequences. So because the things we prefer are often the things that give us pleasure, and the things we prefer not to have are often pains. But it seems on this view, kind of the direction of explanation goes the other way. So it seems the reason we prefer pain we prefer pleasure, is that it is good. It's not that it's good because we prefer it. But are there parts in ethics or practical ethics where preference utilitarianism and hedonistic utilitarianism come apart? So the question really, have you had to revise some of your practical ethics views as a result of this shift?
I do think there are places where they come apart. How much they come apart depends a little on how you understand preferences. But the way I understood them, and also the way R.M. Hare understood them, was that you don't actually have to know that your preference is satisfied for it to count as enhancing your well-being, that it is satisfied. So there may be examples where you prefer a certain state of affairs. Parfit actually gives an example of this, which is a bit puzzling. It's a sort of a problem for the preference view. But let's say in Parfit's example, you're on a train journey and there's somebody who happens to be sitting next to you. You start chatting to them. You sort of feel some sympathy with the kind of person they are. And towards the end of the journey, the person tells you that she's actually traveling to have an operation for a serious illness. And you form the preference then that the operation will be successful and that she'll completely recover from the illness. But then she gets off the train. You didn't exchange contact details. You'll never see her again. On the pure preference view, it still is in your interests, it satisfies your preference if her operation is successful and she does recover from her illness, because that's what you preferred, even though you'll never know this. It'll never have any impact on your consciousness. And of course, for the hedonistic utilitarian, that's not true. It doesn't change your happiness, as you will never know. It changes her happiness, of course, and it's good for that, but it's not good for you. So there are some cases like that, those sorts of preferences we have, where they do come apart. Another perhaps more significant way in which they come apart is in views about why and when is killing wrong, just taking killing for its own sake, or killing in itself rather than other factors about it. So I defended the view in a lot of my work in practical ethics when I was a preference utilitarian, that killing a being who is self-aware is more serious than killing a being who is not. And the reason for that is that if you're self-aware, as you and I are, and everybody watching this is, you know that you're going to live over time. You know that as long as things go well, you'll have a future. And you have preferences for that future. You plan for that future. You're thinking about what you're going to do next summer. You're thinking about maybe, getting married with somebody or having children. You're thinking about completing your studies and getting a job. And a lot of the things that you do now and next week and next month are all only make sense because you have these preferences for the future. So if you kill a being like that, then you're thwarting all of those preferences. If you kill a being who is not self-aware, and that could be some non-human animals who I think are not self-aware in that way, could also be very young humans or humans with very profound intellectual disabilities who also don't think of themselves in that way. And I argued that that's therefore a less serious thing. It's harder to justify killing somebody who wants to go on living when they have that view of their existence over time. I've sometimes used the term to say when they're a person, defining person as somebody who sees themselves as existing over time in that way. And that did give, I think, a reasonably intuitively satisfying explanation of why some forms of killing are worse than others. With the hedonistic view, it's not that easy to draw those distinctions. There are some things that you can still say that will go along with this sort of somewhat similar distinction. So you could still say, well, beings who are self-aware are likely to learn if other beings like them are killed. So when there's a terrorist attack, let's say, that kills lots of people, we think, oh, that could have been me, or that could have been my children. I'm now more anxious about this. I'm it reduces my sense of security and therefore my well-being. So that's sort of one factor that we could say draws that distinction between beings who are self-aware and beings who are not. So beings who are not self-aware, again, very young humans can't be, their well-being isn't immediately affected by a terrorist act. And that's true for non-human animals as well. So there are still some distinctions, but they're less, it's less clear. And so I really need to rethink my views about killing and when killing becomes wrong as a hedonist rather than as the preference utilitarian I used to be.
Right. You wrote a book, I think almost 15 years ago, called Pushing Time Away, about your grandfather, David Oppenheim, who was an Austrian Jew who died in a ghetto where he was sent by the Nazis. He was a scholar and an author, and you write, one of the acquaintances of Sigmund Freud, and he wanted to be remembered, you write. And you ask in an article that you wrote if him actually being remembered and being respected as who he was as a father, as a scholar, if that could kind of mitigate some of the harm that was done to him and in a sense retroactively make his life better. And you write that you're uncertain about where you're going to go. Is it the case now that you've decided that no, it can't actually help him, that it will only be for the people in the future?
Yes, I think that's correct. It was only on the basis of a preference view and a preference view where you don't have to know about your preferences, because of course the preferences for what happens to you after you die, you can't know about whether they're satisfied or not. So I think it does resolve that question, and it resolves it in the negative. You can't make things better for people who are dead. I can't make things better for my grandfather by writing this book about him. And the value of writing the book has to be a value for the people who read about him. And perhaps that's something good. Perhaps it still brings to light one of the victims of the Holocaust, one of the many millions of victims. And instead of seeing that as a statistic, it helps you to see the many different individuals with their lives that were cut off in that way. So it may do good in a variety of ways, but I guess you might say sadly, it can't do good anymore for my grandfather.
Sadly, in one way, maybe, but also it's also good that we can't harm people from the past.
Well, that's true.
It would be very sad if we could also harm Aristotle, and we could harm people from far back in the past by what we do now.
So every time we misinterpret some dead philosopher, that we've harmed them, I guess. Yes, that's true.
So in a sense, there are fewer to care for. You're best known for your work in ethics, but you've also written, for example, introductions to both Hegel and Marx, which I think fewer people can intuitively know. And I'm curious about this. What other areas of philosophy is it that interest you, and what kind of questions, if any, outside of ethics do you think are very important and perhaps unresolved?
Yeah, let me just say the little book on Marx that you mentioned, just at the end of last month, I finished a revision of that book. So it'll be published next year in time for the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, which is May 2018. So I'm hoping a few people will know a little bit more about the book again after it comes out. So I do think that questions of political philosophy are interesting and important. I've mostly dealt with ethics, and very often that's been ethics addressed to the question, what ought you to do? What's the right thing for you to do as an individual? Not so much the question, what is the right thing for us to do as a society, as a community? But I do think they're very important questions, and I think they're interesting questions, and I do, some of my writing goes over into that sort of public policy level. I suppose I haven't really written any foundational stuff on political philosophy, but yes, I'm definitely interested in it. Other areas of philosophy, I find various areas of philosophy intrinsically interesting, but to me that's not enough justification for me to put a lot of time and energy into them. I think I decided quite early in my philosophical career that I wanted to work on areas of philosophy that can make a difference to the world, to how people live, and so I put aside, there are really interesting philosophical questions that as undergraduates we all get taught about and talk about. How do I know there's a table here in front of me, that I'm not dreaming, that there's not a demon who's somehow got some hallucination going, or in more modern terms, that I'm not in the matrix, something like that. But those questions can't really make a practical difference, even if they're intellectually interesting. We can't change our lives. It wouldn't make sense to change our lives. So those ones I'm not so interested in. I suppose connected with some of my work about animals and some of my work about humans, I'm interested in questions about consciousness. What is consciousness? Because, as I've been saying, it's crucial for my view that a being is conscious, or will be conscious, can be conscious, for it to matter morally. I don't think it matters intrinsically what we do to objects that can't be conscious, although it may matter instrumentally a great deal, of course. And so then you have questions about, well, what is consciousness, and how can we know whether another being is conscious? There's problems in philosophy of mind. And they particularly get interesting when you talk about creatures where we really can't be certain. I very often get asked when I talk about animals, where do you draw the line? Should I not slap a mosquito because it might be conscious? So what would it take to convince us that an insect is conscious, or conversely that it's not conscious? I think those are interesting and important questions. And you could ask them also about computers too, and it's another interesting area that we're getting, well, some people think we're getting closer to. If we build computers that could convince us, we could certainly build computers that would pass the famous Turing test, in that we couldn't tell whether we were having a discussion with a computer or with another human. But I don't think that would show, if a computer passed the Turing test, that it is actually conscious. It would just show that it was had been very cleverly programmed to simulate a consciousness, or it might show that. But I think it's conceivable that computers could be conscious. And again, how would we know that that was the case?
So it seems that certain views in philosophy of mind, like functionalism, for example, is something that you would be inclined to reject. But when it comes to like essential problems, like the hard problem, for example, as David Chalmers calls it, do you have a kind of tentative view on kind of how the mind fits into the material world? Or is it a question you've bracketed?
Yeah, I don't think I have a tentative view, or I don't have a tentative view that's worth expressing, because so many other very good philosophers, David Chalmers obviously is one of them, and there are other very good philosophers who strongly disagree with his view, and they've put a lot of work and time into it, and I haven't. So I'm saying, maybe I will come and think more about that at some point. Would be a good thing to do, but there's always time pressures and other things to do. So at the moment, I'm leaving that to others to work on.
Yeah, I guess being a utilitarian also places constraints on what to write about.
Exactly, yes.
Yes.
Is it really going to be, am I going to make any significant difference to this area in which I'm a novice, rather than things that I can do in other areas that have developed more expertise in?
Yes, and of course you've been very successful when it comes to having an impact on your philosophy. One is the impact of animal liberation, but another thing that is perhaps even more gets even more attention now is the effective altruism movement that you have helped launch or inspired. And it seems to me that as this movement is growing, and I'm wondering if you kind of share my impression of this, that there has been a shift in the movement. It started with a very significant focus on things like bed nets or curing simple infections, but it seems to have shifted somewhat away from that and over to more kind of long-term perspectives. Toby Ord, for example, an effective altruist, has coined this term long-termism, about the importance of the long term, because of course we who live now are just a little tiny portion of all of those who will live. So just a tiny amount of welfare exists now. And there seems to have been this kind of gradual focus, on institution building, on regulations, on artificial intelligence, on avoiding bioterrorism and things like that. Do you share the impression that the effective altruism community has shifted its focus a bit? And if you agree on that, do you think that is a good thing?
So has the effective altruism community shifted its focus? I think it depends a little on what you mean by the effective altruism community. It's quite a broad community. It has a lot of people involved at a rather limited level. So it has a lot of university-based organizations, for instance, where there are students who have an interest in it, are affected by it to some extent with their involvement, affected by it perhaps to some extent in their choice of career, also if they start donating to what organizations they donate to. So I can't put a figure on it, but there's a large number of people involved in effective altruism. And my view is that most of them are still involved in the kinds of issues that you talked about, the short-term issues, if you like distributing bed nets to prevent people getting malaria, and various things, but mainly focused on people in extreme poverty. And of course, they're not only short-term. They may help people to escape poverty and help developing countries to develop and have various long-term implications that we can't fully foresee. But if you're talking about the people who are really involved in effective altruism as their primary life activity, people who are involved in organizations like the Center for Effective Altruism, then probably I think you're right that more of them have shifted to these longer-term views and longer-term projects. And certainly there's a lot more talk about what they call existential risk, the risk of our species becoming extinct, and how to reduce that risk. And people like, you mentioned Toby Ord, but also Nick Bostrom, who's also a philosopher at Oxford, has argued that for our species to become extinct would be a disaster on a scale that just absolutely dwarfs anything that we do now, because if we don't become extinct, if we sort of get through this current phase, then eventually we may colonize other planets, and so it's much less likely we would ever become extinct, and then we might exist for a billion years, or even longer, and on a vast scale. So the potential for happiness and good lives is enormous compared to just the the mere 7.6 billion lives that are existing on this planet now. And that makes sense in a way. To me, part of the problem with it is it's much harder to know what is going to be positive in that long-term view, what things will contribute to a better long-term future and what won't. That's one concern. I mean, if somebody gives me a really good argument that I have to accept for saying, here's something that is going to make things better, that is going to reduce the risks of human extinction, or is going to produce better lives for humans for a very long time, then that would certainly be a good reason for giving that priority over the more immediate things. But in the absence of that, I think reducing immediate suffering is still a very important goal.
Yes, it seems that this is a very important question for utilitarians, how they view, say, the value or the disvalue of human extinction. Because some hedonists, like Epicurus, for example, would say that, of course, if at some point all humans died, there would be no joy, but there would be no suffering either. There would be no one to miss out on this. Mm-hmm. So it seems he has or perhaps Epicurus and David Benatar as well would hold the extreme on the one side, while Toby Ord seems to hold this very strong, what one might call the deprivationist account, where there is still someone who misses out on this. Do you side more towards one view than the other here?
Yeah, let me just say, I think there's two different things going on here that it might be worth separating. One is whether you are an optimist or a pessimist about human life as it is now, right? So you mentioned David Benatar. So David Benatar believes, if I understand him correctly, that life on the whole is bad already now. That is, that even for each of us, our lives have more negative things in them, more suffering than they do happiness. So if that's so, and if that's likely to continue to be so, and Benatar thinks it is, then it wouldn't be a good thing for our species to continue. Really, it would be best if we all stopped having children so that the species doesn't continue. And that's true whether you're focused on people who are existing already or people who will exist. So that's one question. And on that, I'm an optimist. It does seem to me that life for most humans now, and for many non-humans, although it's a bit more debatable with some non-human animals perhaps, but that life is on the whole positive rather than negative. There's more happiness or well-being than there is suffering. The other question is, would it matter if no more beings were to come into existence? So there's nobody who misses out. This is the Epicurean point. There's nobody who's, waiting there in limbo, thinking, "Oh, damn! Now I'm never going to get born." That's obviously nonsense. So that's not what we ought to worry about. But should we worry about the fact that there will not be more beings who will have rich, fulfilling, happy lives? And here I think, yes, we should. And one brief argument as to why we should is, think of the negative case. Think of a couple who are told by a genetic counselor that if they have a child, this child will suffer from a genetic disease that will cause the child to suffer horribly for, let's say, a year and then die. And there's no cure, no treatment. But suppose the woman says, "Oh, never mind, I'd like to experience being pregnant and I want to have my own child, and I don't really care whether my child suffers or not. I just want to have the experience of that." I think we would think that was a really horrible thing to do, to inflict a year of suffering on a child when you don't have to get pregnant, don't have to have that child. So if that's a bad thing, if we're saying now, even though the child doesn't exist now, we're saying you should not go ahead with this, because if you do, there will be a future child who will be miserable, and that will be bad. Then it's hard to see why we shouldn't also say, if you have good reason for thinking that your child is likely to be happy, let's say you're a couple who live in an affluent, secure country, you're by temperament, you're people who are happy with life, positive rather than depressed, and you know that you have genes that will pass this on to your child. So your child is very likely to have a good, happy life. If it's a bad thing to bring the miserable child in the world, I'm inclined to say it's a good thing to bring the happy child into the world. Again, other things being equal, right? Of course, maybe the world is overpopulated and it's going to be bad for other people to have more children. But I'm assuming here we're talking about a situation in which that isn't the case. We're just talking about it from the point of view of the future child.
And then I guess it could also be wrong not to have an extra child, if that child could have a good life.
Well, it could be a wrong, yes. Again, other things being equal, all right? I mean, if you really don't want to have this child, that clearly counts in the part of the equation. You know, maybe the effects on others may count. But yes, if you were on this view, if you and your partner were sort of, oh, shall we have children, shall we not have children, just from our point of view, you know, yes, there'd be some pleasure in having your children, but we wouldn't be able to work as hard in our careers, we wouldn't be as successful, we wouldn't be able to take the adventure holidays that we do for a few years. So, you know, I'm pretty much indifferent. But then you say, and what about the child? Then I think if the chances are the child will have a good, happy life, that should tip the balance for you.
So in a sense, we could also regret happy people that weren't born.
I think we could, yeah, I mean, probably not now with the world and its environmental problems, but you could certainly imagine that in a less populated world, you would regret that there weren't more happy people to enjoy the lives that they were having.
And of course, there's a kind of a famous thought experiment or example in philosophy where one considers, you know, happy people in the future. So there's the question of what would be the best future. If you have 1 million people who are very happy, or if you have 10 billion people who are not so happy. So let's say the 1 million people, let's say a million, are at 100 out of 100 on the happiness scale. So there is 100 million happiness points. Well, in the other world, there's 100 billion people, but they're just on one happiness level each. So there's more happiness units, more hedons, if you want, in the other world. And this then is known as the repugnant conclusion. There's some repugnance, one thinks, in preferring the large population of people who are just barely above the 0 point. Right. There's something wrong in preferring that world. But would you prefer the world with many people who were just above the 0 point over the smaller population that is very, very happy?
Yeah, this is a really baffling puzzle. I first encountered it when I was a graduate student at Oxford in either 1969 or 1970, something like that, so a very long time ago. I've tried writing about it. I've read a lot of stuff. I got it from Derek Parfit, who was then teaching a class on that, and he tried throughout his life to find answers to it. Sadly, he died in January of this year without really having solved it. Other people have worked on it. There are problems whichever way you go in this, right? So yes, you know, most people think the idea of this world with 100 billion people at just this life level that's barely worth living, that there's something repugnant about thinking that's a better world than the world with 100 million at a very, very good level. But as compared with the problems you get into if you deny that, I'm probably inclined to say, you know, at least this total view, as it's called, which says just add up the total and go for the biggest total, at least that's consistent, coherent, we can apply it. It doesn't give rise to the same real difficulties and incoherences that the other at first seemingly plausible views get into.
So it seems that your way of handling the repugnant conclusion would be to admit that it might be or seem counterintuitive, but to say that doesn't count that much against it, because we have other reasons to favor utilitarianism in spite of this. Now, is this because you reject intuitions as such, as what we should use in ethics, or is the reason for this that you believe that some intuitions are trustworthy while others are not?
Well, I reject. I'm more inclined to reject intuitions about particular cases, and I'm especially inclined to reject intuitions about particular cases where these are fantastic examples that we are never really likely to encounter. So the case that you just mentioned about where we can choose between these two worlds, our intuitions have no real grip on that in terms of thinking about the real world, because of course there are no such choices. And so although going for the larger total may seem repugnant to us, I don't know that we can rely on that intuition very much. Just as, to use another example that I discuss in the Utilitarianism, a very short introduction, when Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov asks, or Ivan poses the question, so would you essentially bring about peace on earth forever, but you have to torture this one child now to do it? And most people think, oh, I could never torture a small child, what a horrible thing to do. Of course that would be wrong. But Dostoevsky doesn't explain how torturing a small child is going to bring about peace on earth forever. And we don't have, any intuitions in situations where it would. So I'm inclined to say the intuition that it's wrong to torture the child, even in these quite, hypothetical circumstances, are not a reliable guide to whether utilitarianism is right or not. Now, I do think there are some intuitions which are a little different. They're the ones where we try to carefully reflect on what is of intrinsic value. So, for example, I earlier talked about the view that I now hold, that I think it's clear that for someone to be in agony is intrinsically bad, and conversely, for someone to experience pleasure is intrinsically good. Intrinsically, right? It may not be on balance when you take other effects, but in itself, it's good for pleasure, bad for agony. So those are judgments that I think we have direct knowledge of what agony and what pleasure is like, and therefore you could say this is an intuition, this is a sort of a self-evident belief, we experience this. How can it not be a bad thing or a good thing? So I don't want to say that there are no intuitions that we can rely on. I think that would make it very difficult to do ethics at all. But I do think that many of the intuitions that we have and that get tested in some of these examples are not reliable.
Yeah, it seems in the case of pleasure and pain, we have this immediate feeling of the goodness of pleasure and the badness of pain. So it seems that if there's anything in ethics that could be kind of immediately justified, it would have to be something like the goodness of pleasure and the badness of pain. But in the case of, for example, going from hedonism to utilitarianism, it seems that there we also have some other kind of more theoretical, maybe, intuitions about everyone counting equally, for example, and that everyone's welfare is kind of gives reasons for everyone, which is the utilitarian view. Mm-hmm. And if this is a truth, it is presumably a truth that exists somewhere. You have suggested, I think, a parallel to mathematics, probably, in one of your works. But this really ties to kind of the meta-ethics of the utilitarian project. Because then the question comes, what is the status of these truths? And how do we gain knowledge of them? I would assume that you wouldn't think that there's this Platonic realm that we have some special insight into. Or would you?
No, I don't think that there's a Platonic realm, really. Yeah, I do think that it's a truth, for example, that the happiness of any other individual in the universe matters as much as my own, assuming that that other individual is capable of as much happiness as I am. That's something that Henry Sidgwick talked about. He said it was referred to it as taking the point of view of the universe, and sort of detaching yourself from your own situation and looking at it that way. I do think that that's a truth that we can appreciate and understand directly. But how one actually presents that to somebody who doesn't see it is difficult. And in what sense it's a part of the world is also mysterious. But I do make the parallel with mathematics, as you suggested, and I don't think we have to say that there's a Platonic realm of numbers or of theorems or mathematical truths. I see them as truths of reason. I see both the truths of mathematics and the truths of ethics as truths of reason. And in that, that they exist in the sense that anywhere in the universe where beings have evolved to be rational, they would be capable of understanding those truths, both the mathematical ones and the ethical ones. So that's not to say that they exist somewhere, but it's just to say reasoning can lead you to see these things. So do they exist? That depends on what you mean by existing.
Right. I'm also interested here then is, if there was a being who had never experienced pleasure or pain, would ethics be completely unintelligible to that being? Or would they have some access to it? Or is the pleasure, that I can feel that my pleasure is good and that my pain is bad, is that my access to values?
Well, you said a being who's never experienced pleasure or pain. Do they have experiences that they regard as in some way positive or negative, or not?
Because the idea would be that they can see things and they can reason about things, but there's no such thing as hedonic valence.
Right.
So nothing feels good or bad.
Right. And do they have any preferences?
Presumably they don't.
Right. Okay. Then I think there is no value for them in the world. They don't have access to value.
Right. Right. Finally, you are a remarkably clear and engaging writer. And there's this introduction to philosophy course at the University of Oslo that all students have to take, which is also the reason that you're invited here to Norway to give the XFIL lecture, where 3 of your papers are assigned and have been assigned for quite a long time. I remember when I took this course, I remember reading your articles and taking a lot of pleasure in reading them. Many of the others are original texts by, significantly older thinkers that can be, Kant and Aristotle, for example. And I also have taught this course later, and, your articles are, well regarded by students. They get the discussion going in class. And I'm wondering, therefore, what do you think characterizes good philosophical writing? And how do you go about writing an article? How do you do this? Are you able to write articles that are at the same time very accessible and engaging, and at the same time philosophically novel? What's the writing process like for you?
Well, I think the first process before you start writing is to find the problems that you want to write about. And for me, there are 2 criteria. First, is this an important issue? Is this an issue that in some way will make a difference? And of course, some of the things I write about are more important than others. As we've been saying, I've written about why we ought to help people in extreme poverty. There are hundreds of millions of people in extreme poverty we could help. I've written about the suffering of animals. There are literally tens of billions of animals that humans may suffer. But I've also written about other problems that are less significant. I write about whether we should legalize physician assistance in dying. That's going to help a small number of people. I think it does reduce suffering, but at a much smaller scale. And no doubt there are others that are less important still. But so find a problem that does matter in some way. And secondly, it has to, if you're writing as a philosopher, it has to have some philosophical depths to it. So if it were just a factual problem, if it were just a matter of, say, let's work out what the consequences of this will be, and then we'll all agree, and we only differ because we disagree about the consequences of what's going to happen or not, then that's not really an issue for philosophers. But if you have issues that are both important and that raise interesting philosophical questions where underlying ethical views are relevant, that's a very good start, I think. And then the next thing that I like to do, if possible, is to show that they may be relevant to the reader. And again, questions about what we eat are obviously going to be relevant to the reader. Questions about what should I spend my money on are relevant to the reader. Some other questions like, is it okay to have an abortion, may be relevant to some readers at some times, but not quite to the, not to everybody all the time, of course. And some questions may be less relevant still. But so I like to, other things being equal, I'll choose the ones that are more relevant to the reader, because I think then the reader gets gripped by this and starts to think about it. And then you mentioned that I'm a clear writer, and that does take work. I think you need to really think about the way you're writing, particularly if you're an academic and a lot of your, a lot of what you do is read work that other academic philosophers have produced. You may assume that there's certain terms that everybody understands, but in fact there are kind of technical terms or jargon terms, or they're used in special ways that really philosophers know but other people don't. So you have to really consciously try to get rid of language that other people won't understand. And you also have to avoid the tendency to try and show how profound you are by writing things in an unnecessarily complicated and difficult way. And I think, again, a lot of philosophers don't do this, and I'd say actually particularly continental European philosophers seem to be more obscure often in their writing than philosophers that come out of the analytic tradition, and I think that's just unnecessary and undesirable. So try to always really say, can I write this more clearly? You can never do it in the first draft, or I can never do it in the first draft. It always takes reading over and correcting and changing things a few times before you've really eliminated the things that are unclear or unnecessarily difficult. And if you can do that, then you're likely to be able to engage your readers.
Well, you're a clear writer, and you're certainly a clear speaker as well. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Great. It's been good talking to you.